In the silence that follows a battlefield, history often tells us about the men who died with swords in their hands, about the victors who rode back in triumph, and about the treaties that redrew the maps of kingdoms. Yet hidden in the shadows of these chronicles lies another story, one that rarely finds its place in the polished lines of official histories. When the Ottoman armies advanced across Europe and the Middle East, they left behind not only broken walls and fallen kings, but also women, wives, mothers, daughters, suddenly stripped of the lives they once knew. Their husbands slain, their homes reduced to ashes, these women became the spoils of victory. But what awaited them was not death, it was something more subtle, more prolonged, and perhaps far more cruel. For the Ottomans understood that conquest was not only the defeat of soldiers, it was the reshaping of entire peoples. And in the bodies, identities and destinies of these women, they carved a form of domination that went beyond the battlefield. To be taken alive was not salvation, it was the beginning of a transformation that erased names, silenced traditions, and bound generations to a power they had never chosen. Tonight, we will step into that forgotten silence. We will walk through the slave markets of Istanbul, glimpse the hidden chambers of the harem, and listen to the faint echoes of chronicles that spoke of humiliation and survival. We will ask a haunting question. Was this fate, endured by the wives of defeated warriors, truly worse than death itself? So let us begin our journey, slowly, carefully, with an open mind, for the past does not whisper gently. It lingers, heavy, and it demands that we remember. The Ottoman way of war. The Ottoman Empire did not rise in an instant. It expanded like the steady beating of a war drum, rhythm upon rhythm, until the echoes reached across continents. By the 15th and 16th centuries, its armies had become one of the most feared forces the world had ever known. To understand what would later happen to the wives of defeated warriors, we must first look at the methods of Ottoman conquest itself. Victory was not merely measured in territory gained or fortresses taken, it was measured in people, bodies, minds, and souls that were absorbed into the empire. The Ottoman way of war was deeply strategic. Their armies combined heavy cavalry, archers, and most famously the Janissaries, an elite infantry drawn from the Christian populations of the Balkans. These soldiers were not born Ottoman, they were made Ottoman through the devshirme system, a forced levy of boys taken from their families and raised as warriors of the Sultan. In this practice, we can already glimpse the empire's philosophy. Conquest was not only about destroying an enemy, but about reshaping the defeated into instruments of Ottoman power. When Ottoman banners appeared on the horizon, they carried both promise and terror. To submit often meant survival, albeit under heavy taxation and humiliation. To resist, however, meant devastation. Towns that dared to fight back were crushed with ruthless efficiency. Men were slaughtered on the battlefield, leaders executed or displayed as warnings, and the survivors, particularly the women and children, became living reminders of Ottoman victory. And it was here, in the aftermath of war, where the fate of the defeated wives began to unfold. For in the Ottoman imagination, the conquest of women was as symbolic as the conquest of land. The broken families of fallen warriors served as proof that no resistance could remain intact. Husbands perished, but the women living, breathing, and still tied to memory became the empire's spoils, reshaped in ways that stripped them of the identities they once carried proudly. This was not accidental. It was a deliberate extension of warfare, a silent continuation of battle after the swords had been sheathed. The Ottomans understood that fear was often more powerful than the sword itself. Their victories were not just battles won, they were performances carefully staged to echo far beyond the battlefield. The burning of a town, the public execution of a defeated ruler, or the parade of captives through a newly conquered city were as much messages as they were acts of punishment. The empire thrived on reputation. Tales of Ottoman cruelty and magnificence spread quickly across Europe and Asia, carried by merchants, travelers, and fleeing survivors. Long before the Sultan's armies appeared on the horizon, whispers of their approach often broke the will of entire towns. Resistance crumbled not only under force but under the dread of what would follow. For the Ottomans did not wage war for destruction alone. Their empire relied on absorbing the resources, the wealth, and above all, the human lives of the conquered. Skilled artisans were relocated to Istanbul to build its mosques and palaces. Scholars and scribes were taken to enrich the imperial court. Farmers and villagers were pressed into labor to feed the ever-expanding machine of conquest. And yet, beneath these utilitarian acts of empire, there remained a darker truth, one that carried a far more intimate violence. The defeat of warriors was only half the victory. The other half lay in what became of those warriors' families. Wives, daughters, and mothers were treated not merely as prisoners, but as living symbols of a broken enemy. To seize the women of the conquered was to erase the line between victor and vanquished. It was to say, your bloodline now belongs to us, your legacy ends here. It was a conquest of the private world, of hearth and home, carried out in the aftermath of military triumph. This philosophy of reshaping both land and lineage would define the Ottoman way of war, and it would mark the beginning of the long ordeal for the wives of defeated warriors who found themselves thrust from familiar lives into an existence that was neither death nor true survival, but something caught painfully in between, captivity and humiliation. For the wives of defeated warriors, the moment of capture was the true beginning of their ordeal. Death in battle, swift and final, was denied to them. Instead, they faced a long unraveling of identity and dignity. After the clash of swords and the cries of war had fallen silent, soldiers moved through the conquered towns, gathering the spoils of victory. Women were torn from the remnants of their homes, often while the bodies of their husbands or fathers still lay lifeless nearby. There was no time for mourning, no final rites, no quiet farewell. The conqueror's claim was immediate. These women were forced into marches that could last weeks. Stripped of possessions, they carried nothing but exhaustion and grief. Bound in groups, sometimes by ropes, they walked under the watchful eyes of guards who treated them not as human beings but as property. Along the roads, villagers who witnessed these processions saw not just captives but warnings. Humiliation was deliberate. To the Ottomans, the subjugation of women was a symbolic extension of battlefield victory. They represented what had been lost, the pride of families, the honor of warriors, the very heart of the defeated people. By reducing them to captives, the empire proclaimed that even the most private sanctuaries of their enemies could be broken. It was not uncommon for captives to be paraded through villages before being taken further. The spectacle carried a brutal message. Resistance would not only bring death to the men, but shame to their wives and daughters. A kingdom might rebuild its walls, but a family broken in this way rarely recovered its spirit. For the women themselves, the torment was twofold. There was the visible humiliation, the marches, the public displays, the stripping away of status. But there was also the invisible wound, the gnawing knowledge that their identities as wives, as mothers, as daughters of a proud lineage were about to be rewritten against their will. And so captivity began, not in chains, but in the slow erasure of self. The journey of captivity did not end on the battlefield or along the dusty roads that led away from ruined villages. For most of the wives taken by Ottoman soldiers, the next destination was far more terrifying: the slave markets. Istanbul, Bursa, and other major Ottoman cities became the centers where captives were processed and displayed. Upon arrival, the women were sorted and inspected with chilling precision. Age, beauty, and health determined their value. The wives of noblemen and warriors were often singled out, their very status twisted into another form of humiliation. Once symbols of dignity and honor in their homelands, they now stood as commodities to be examined like livestock. The marketplace itself was a theater of human despair. Rows of captives, stripped of their familiar clothing, stood in silence while buyers assessed their worth. There was no distinction between a farmer's widow and a noble's lady. Both were reduced to their physical attributes, their skills, or the potential roles they could serve in Ottoman households. Some would be purchased for labor, destined to spend the rest of their lives in kitchens, fields, or workshops. Others, especially the young and the strikingly beautiful, faced a different path: assimilation into the harems of the Ottoman elite. This did not mean immediate luxury or favor, as later myths sometimes suggest. For many, it was a process of breaking and reshaping, a stripping away of past identity until nothing of their former life remained. Humiliation was not only physical but spiritual. Conversion to Islam was often demanded, not as a matter of faith freely chosen, but as a condition of survival. A new name replaced the old, a new language silenced the words of childhood, and new rules dictated every gesture and movement. The women were not simply captured, they were remade, their memories forced into silence. For those who had once walked proudly as wives of warriors, this was a punishment worse than death. They became living symbols of a broken lineage, existing proof that the empire's conquest extended beyond the battlefield and into the very blood of its enemies. In their captivity, the humiliation was endless, but it also carried a cruel permanence. What had been lost would never return, and who they once were could never be recovered. The slave markets and harems. The slave markets of the Ottoman world were not hidden corners of shame. They were public institutions, woven into the daily fabric of the empire. Merchants, travelers, and foreign envoys all recorded their impressions of these places, often with a mixture of horror and fascination. For those who entered as captives, however, the markets were the threshold to a life that no longer belonged to them. Istanbul, the empire's beating heart, held some of the largest and most organized slave bazaars. The process was systematic. Women were displayed in groups, standing silently while buyers walked among them, assessing posture, complexion, and youth. Some were forced to demonstrate skills, singing, embroidery, or even basic household tasks to prove their potential usefulness. Others were judged solely on appearance, their fates decided by the nod of a head or the gesture of a hand. For the wives of defeated warriors, this moment was especially bitter. They had once occupied positions of respect and authority in their households. Many had managed estates, raised children, and carried the honor of their families. Now, under the gaze of strangers, they were stripped of every marker of that dignity. Their worth was reduced to price, their futures to ownership. The path of a captive woman diverged sharply after the market. Some were bought for labor in provincial households or estates, living lives of endless toil. Others, those deemed beautiful, young, or promising, were directed toward a different fate, the harems of Ottoman elites. Contrary to later romanticized tales, the harem was not simply a place of luxury and silken cushions. For the women taken there, it was a place of confinement, competition, and constant vigilance. Every detail of their lives was regulated, from the clothing they wore to the words they spoke. To survive, they were expected to embrace the erasure of their past identities and submit fully to the rhythms of their new world. The transition from wife of a free warrior to captive of a conquering empire was not just physical, it was psychological. It was the reshaping of a human being into a symbol, a living testament to Ottoman power. And in that transformation, the women became more than prisoners. They became instruments of domination, used to remind their defeated peoples that resistance had consequences beyond the battlefield. To enter the harem was to step into a world both hidden and rigidly controlled. Outsiders often imagined it as a place of indulgence and luxury, but for the women who lived within its walls, it was a prison as much as a palace. The harem was a hierarchy, a carefully constructed order where every woman had a rank and role. At the bottom were the newly purchased captives. Frightened, disoriented, and stripped of their past lives, they were the lowest in status, serving the needs of others while learning the strict rules that governed daily existence. Above them stood the Kalfa and Usta, women who had proven themselves loyal and obedient, tasked with overseeing the newcomers and enforcing discipline. At the very top stood the favored concubines and the powerful valid sultan, the sultan's mother, whose authority often surpassed that of ministers and generals. For the wives of defeated warriors, to be forced into this system was an agony of contrasts. They had once commanded respect in their own households. Now they were expected to bow, to serve, and to silence any memory of what they had been. Their names were replaced with new ones, chosen to suit Ottoman tastes. Their clothes, once symbols of their homeland, were exchanged for garments that erased individuality. Even their speech was reshaped, as they were taught the Turkish language and forbidden to speak in their native tongues. Life in the harem demanded complete submission. A woman who resisted might face beatings, confinement, or worse, but survival depended on adaptation. Some learned to navigate the labyrinth of rules, rising in influence by pleasing their masters or gaining skills valued within the palace. Yet for many, the struggle was not to rise, but simply to endure, to preserve some fragment of self within a world designed to erase it. The cruelty of this fate lay not only in the physical captivity, but in the slow corrosion of memory. A woman's former life, her husband, her home, her culture, became a forbidden past. Over time, what had been once a proud wife of a warrior became someone unrecognizable, even to herself. It was this transformation, this forced assimilation into an empire that thrived on the silence of its captives, that made their suffering feel to many worse than death. Forced assimilation. To conquer land was one victory, to conquer memory was another. The Ottomans understood this well, and so the fate of captured women did not end with chains or walls. It extended into the slow, deliberate remaking of their very identities. The process of forced assimilation began the moment a woman entered Ottoman control. Her old name, perhaps a name tied to centuries of lineage, was stripped away. In its place came a new one, often chosen casually, sometimes reflecting qualities admired in the empire: beauty, loyalty, or piety. To speak her old name aloud became an act of defiance, one that risked punishment. Religion was the next battleground. Conversion to Islam was often required, though not always through formal ceremony. It could be as subtle as being forbidden to practice one's faith, or as blunt as public recitation of Islamic prayers under watchful eyes. For many women, this was not the embrace of a new belief, but a survival strategy. To refuse was to risk isolation or death. To comply was to endure with the faint hope of life continuing. Language, too, became a tool of domination. Women were compelled to learn Turkish, the language of their new masters, and silence their native tongues. In the harem, speaking in one's mother language was seen not as communication, but as rebellion. With each forgotten word, another thread of their former identity unraveled. Even daily habits, the way a woman dressed, how she bowed, how she ate, were reshaped. The familiar rituals of home were replaced with rigid codes of Ottoman life. Slowly, a woman became less of who she had been and more of what the empire demanded. This was assimilation, not as integration, but as erasure, a slow death of the self, carried out in the name of survival. And for the wives of defeated warriors, it was a torment unlike any battlefield wound. Their bodies lived, but their histories were buried. Assimilation was not only a matter of survival, it was also a deliberate political weapon. The Ottoman rulers understood that the women they absorbed were more than individuals, they were living symbols of conquered peoples. To reshape them was to proclaim that entire lineages, once proud and defiant, now belonged to the empire. Some of these women were chosen for roles that went far beyond servitude. A select few entered the higher circles of the harem, where they could become concubines of princes, pashas, or even the sultan himself. In these cases, their assimilation carried a chilling finality. The children they bore would no longer carry the bloodline of their fallen fathers, but instead the future of the very empire that had destroyed their world. This transformation was not only intimate but public. To present a former noblewoman as a concubine of the court was a message to her people. Resistance had ended, and its legacy was now tied to Ottoman power. The very children of the defeated were remade as Ottoman heirs, their original heritage dissolved into silence. Even outside the palace, assimilation reached deep. Captive women placed in provincial households often became wives or concubines to Ottoman soldiers or administrators. Here too the pattern repeated: a new religion, a new language, a new life imposed by necessity. Over time, communities that had once resisted began to see their own daughters transformed into strangers, their identities erased so thoroughly that only faint traces remained. For the women themselves, the cruelty was not always in visible chains, but in the quiet certainty that they would never again belong to the world they had lost. Every prayer whispered in secret, every memory recalled in silence, became an act of quiet rebellion against an empire determined to reshape them. This was the essence of forced assimilation, not a single act of conquest, but a lifelong captivity of the soul, a captivity that made survival feel like a betrayal of memory, and that turned life itself into a punishment far more enduring than death. The Janissary connection. The tragedy of defeat did not end with the wives of fallen warriors, it extended to their sons. Just as the empire claimed the women of conquered lands, it also claimed the boys, transforming them into instruments of Ottoman power through the devshirme system. This practice, often called the blood tax, required Christian families in the Balkans and other regions to surrender their sons to the state. Taken at a young age, the boys were removed from their families, forbidden to speak their native languages, and raised as Muslims under strict discipline. They were trained to become Janissaries, the elite infantry of the Sultan, feared across the known world. For the wives already broken by captivity, this loss deepened the wound. To lose a husband in battle was sorrow enough. To see a son torn away and remade as the enemy was a punishment beyond comprehension. A child who might have carried forward the lineage of a fallen warrior was instead molded into the very force that had destroyed his family. The Ottomans understood the symbolism of this transformation. Just as captured wives embodied the erasure of identity, the sons taken as Janissaries embodied the rewriting of loyalty. Within a single generation, the empire ensured that both mothers and sons belonged no longer to the memory of the past, but to the machinery of Ottoman power. In this way, the fate of the wives and the fate of the children were bound together. Both were forced into new identities. Both became symbols of a conquest that sought not only to destroy armies, but to unravel the very fabric of defeated societies. For those left behind, fathers, brothers, and neighbors who witnessed this loss, the message was clear. The empire's reach extended beyond death itself. It claimed the living, reshaping them into shadows of what they once were, and in doing so it ensured that no lineage, no family could ever rise again unbroken. The transformation of sons into Janissaries was perhaps the most cruel mirror to the fate of their mothers. While the women were confined within harems or households, forced to abandon their names and faiths, the boys endured a parallel erasure, one that turned them into the sharpest edge of Ottoman conquest. Within the barracks, the boys were subjected to discipline, harsher than any their fathers could have imagined. They were forbidden contact with their families, stripped of their native languages, and trained in absolute obedience to the Sultan. Over time, their loyalty was no longer to their people, but to the empire that had stolen them. Many rose to prominence. Some became commanders, governors, or even grand viziers, yet behind their achievements lay a haunting irony. They were in blood, the descendants of those once slain by Ottoman armies, now carrying the banners of the very force that had orphaned them. This irony was not accidental, it was the empire's design. Just as the wives of warriors embodied the humiliation of the defeated, the sons turned Janissaries embodied the empire's triumph. The Ottomans proclaimed through these transformations that even the future had been conquered. For the mothers who survived in captivity, the knowledge was unbearable. They could never again call their sons their own. To the world, these boys no longer belonged to the memory of fallen fathers, but to the Sultan's will. The blood of the defeated had been grafted onto the living body of the empire, never to return. In this way, the conquest of families was total. Wives, daughters, and sons were reshaped into symbols of Ottoman dominance, their lives no longer threads of resistance, but woven into the empire's vast tapestry of power. And in this transformation lay a cruelty deeper than death, the slow, deliberate undoing of lineage itself. Voices from Chronicles. What we know of these fates does not rest only in modern reflection. It lives within the writings of those who witnessed the Ottoman advance, men who carried quills instead of swords, and whose words captured the echoes of suffering. European envoys, often forced to negotiate at the Ottoman court, described in hushed tones the sight of paraded captives, women led through Istanbul in chains, their eyes lowered not in obedience but in despair. To these outsiders, the spectacle was both shocking and purposeful. They recognized that the empire was not hiding its methods, but displaying them as a calculated warning. Travelers wrote of the slave markets with a mix of fascination and revulsion. Venetian merchants in particular recorded how women of noble birth were lined up beside peasants, their worth reduced to silver coins. Some wrote of wives who, only days before, had presided over banquets in stone halls, now standing silently in crowded bazaars, waiting for strangers to decide their futures. Even Ottoman chroniclers, though less inclined to lament, hinted at these realities. Their records speak of spoils, of captives, and of beauties taken for the palace. Though the tone was one of pride rather than pity, their words confirm what foreign observers described. The wives of fallen warriors were not spared. They were trophies of victory, tokens of the empire's dominance. In folk songs and laments preserved in the Balkans and beyond, we hear another voice, one not of official record, but of sorrow passed down through generations. These songs speak of daughters lost to distant cities, of wives who vanished beyond mountains, of children taken by men in foreign garb. They were not written for courts or chronicles, but for memory, for the people left behind to make sense of a grief that had no remedy. Through these scattered voices, envoys, merchants, chroniclers and villagers, we begin to piece together the silence that official history often overlooked. And within these accounts, the same theme emerges. For the wives of defeated warriors, captivity was not a single moment of loss, but a lifetime of exile from themselves. Among the accounts that survive, some are not vague impressions, but vivid portraits of individual lives torn apart. One Venetian observer recorded the story of a noblewoman captured in Hungary, whose husband had fallen in battle. She was transported to Istanbul and displayed in the marketplace. Though men offered high prices for her, she is said to have stood motionless, her gaze fixed on the ground, refusing even to acknowledge her buyers. To him, this silent defiance was both tragic and noble, a final act of resistance in a world determined to erase her. Another chronicle tells of a procession of captives after the fall of Constantinople in 1453. Survivors wrote that noble women and commoners alike were bound together with ropes, paraded through the broken city. Their cries, echoing through streets littered with smoke and ash, were remembered not only as sounds of sorrow but as symbols of the city's final humiliation. To the conquerors, it was a display of triumph. To the defeated, it was the very image of despair. European diplomats, often forced to witness such scenes, carried these images back to their homelands. Their letters described the harems as prisons of beauty and sorrow, where foreign women lived behind guarded gates, their names and pasts dissolved. While some embellished these tales to inflame anti-Ottoman sentiment, others wrote with a quiet honesty, noting the haunting dignity of women who endured what they could not escape. Even centuries later, the memory of these fates lingered. In the villages of the Balkans, mothers warned their daughters with stories of Ottoman raiders, turning history into folklore and grief into caution. Ballads spoke of brides stolen on their wedding nights, of wives carried across rivers and never seen again. These were not just songs of the past, they were living reminders of wounds that communities carried for generations. From official records to whispered laments, one truth remains clear. The voices of these women were seldom heard directly. They survived through the words of others, envoys, merchants, chroniclers, and neighbors, and yet even in their silence they speak of a torment that was not momentary, but lifelong. Legacy and memory. The Ottoman conquest reshaped borders, kingdoms and dynasties, but its deepest scars were not drawn on maps. They lived within memory. Memory carried in songs, in whispers, and in the silences of families who had lost what could never be restored. For the wives of defeated warriors, their fate was more than an individual tragedy. It became part of the collective imagination of Europe. Across the Balkans, stories of stolen women passed from one generation to the next. Grandmothers sang laments to children who had never seen a battlefield, reminding them that danger could arrive not only with fire and steel, but with the footsteps of men who claimed bodies and futures as spoils of war. In European courts, these stories served as fuel for fear. The image of the Ottoman harem, part truth, part myth, became a symbol of both fascination and horror. Some portrayed it as a place of exotic temptation, filled with luxury and beauty. Others described it as a prison of stolen souls, where noble women languished behind guarded doors, stripped of their heritage. Both images, though opposite in tone, revealed the same unease, the awareness that Ottoman conquest reached far deeper than the battlefield. For the empire itself, the legacy was one of control. By turning wives into concubines and sons into janissaries, the Ottomans projected an image of invincibility. They demonstrated that even the most intimate bonds of their enemies, marriage, motherhood, and family, could be broken and remade in the Sultan's image. This was not only war, it was the rewriting of memory, the bending of lineage, the transformation of the private into a public symbol of defeat. And yet, within this legacy of sorrow, there also lingered resistance, in whispered prayers, in hidden rituals, and in the quiet defiance of memory itself. Women held on to fragments of who they once were. Though the empire sought to erase them, their suffering became the seed of stories that refused to vanish. The memory of their ordeal endured not as a tale of glory, but as a warning that conquest without death can sometimes be the cruelest conquest of all. History often remembers the clash of armies, the treaties signed, the empires that rose and fell. But beneath those grand narratives lie the quiet tragedies that shaped entire generations. The fate of the wives of defeated warriors is one such tragedy, rarely written in chronicles but never forgotten in memory. For those women, survival became a paradox. To live meant to endure a life that was no longer their own. Their children grew up as strangers, their names dissolved into foreign tongues, their identities bound to an empire that had once been their enemy. Death might have been final, but life under such conditions was an unending exile. And yet, even in the silence of captivity, they carried something the empire could never fully erase. Memories whispered in the dark, songs sung in secret, stories handed down in fragments. They kept alive the shadows of what had been lost. In these fragile acts of remembrance, they defied the attempt to erase them. The legacy of their suffering outlasted the Ottoman armies themselves. It lived on in European imagination, in folklore, in the fearful stories told to children at night. It became part of the broader memory of conquest, not only about swords and fortresses, but about the intimate cruelty of reshaping lives against their will. Tonight, as we look back on this chapter of history, we are reminded that the greatest wounds are not always visible. Sometimes they are carved into memory, into lineage, into silence itself. And for the wives of defeated warriors, their torment was not measured in days or years, but in the echo of generations. Their story forces us to ask, what is truly worse, death on the battlefield, or a life where everything you once were is stripped away, leaving only the shadow of survival?